I believe it's Friday afternoon and it's time for me to hold forth again. So, what am I going to start with today? I think I'm going to start with my second child. This too happened in the 1970s. In the face of the distress we were going through, having a multiply handicapped first child, I figured that one thing I could do to improve the quality of life in our house was to have an ordinary child. That may have been crazy, I don't know. But we decided to adopt a second child, and we did get a little girl when my son was about 3.5 years old. Another child came to live with us. Uh, they couldn't have been in greater contrast. One was male, one was female. One was multi handicapped, the other was multi talented and very, very bright. And the thing that now I live with, though, and she'll feature in future presentations about the struggle to maintain her life and to interact with her. But the thing that sticks in my head based on previous lectures I've made is I repeated for her the same trauma I'd gone through. She truly was the restitution child. The purpose of her coming was to fill in for something, was to make something better, was to try to improve something. And that's not a good burden to put on a child. A child should be had because it was time to have a child or because a child was wanted, not because she would help repair something. I I'm sorry for my motivation, and I think it probably leaked out of both my wife and myself. Uh, I suffered plenty from being a restitution child, and I'm afraid some of the suffering she got into as she continued to move through the passage of her lifetime was to feel the special burdens of a restitution child. I also did a second thing in order to try and calm and soothe my wife and make up to her for the terrible blow we had both had. Not only was to give her a good child, but she had always wanted to live in a part of Westwood, California. She had grown up there. It was near the UCLA campus. My finances were getting better as my practice was building in the early years, and I thought it was okay to take a chance on selling the simple little house that was our first house and get a bigger, more gracious, more comfortable house about a mile and a half from the Westwood campus. And we made the down payment and moved in. And that's where I lived out the remaining years that I spent with her before we finally got our divorce. It helped my guilt as I moved towards divorce to know I had taken care of two things for her. I'd given her a wonderful daughter, and I had helped give her a home that she was going to inherit and live in after I left it. All right, that leads into the related topic. Uh, After I lost my connection with the first woman who was my affair partner, I tried to redouble my efforts to try her. I went into couples counseling for a while with my former wife. It didn't seem to do much. Her analyst had picked the man that we went to see, and he was an analyst himself. So after listening to us for 3 visits, he was glad that my wife was in analysis, and he suggested the best solution for me was that I resume my analysis too, and that he wasn't going to work with us as a couple anymore. And as one who was beginning to explore and appreciate the majesty of couples counseling, his traditional holding to the belief that the best thing for anybody to do is go into individual psychoanalysis didn't feel good to me. And I felt very, very disappointed that he was rejecting us. And we didn't seek any further counseling together after that. And I did not go back into a traditional analysis. It took about a year for somebody else to show up. One of the members of the Western Psychological Center, the group practice I was in, her husband had gotten a position in the Monterey Bay area, and she left her practice with us and went up to live in Monterey. So we suddenly had an empty office in the suite again, and we began to shoplace her. She had been 2 years out of graduate school at USC, and she took up a position with her and started to build her practice. Her husband was an internist, and we liked that. That was one of the reasons for taking him on, because we figured he might be a good referral source for us. Oh, that's a funny story. When I went to work with my new partners, the first thing I asked was there some good reason to be located in a medical building, to have our practices there? Because the rents are higher in medical buildings than they are in general purpose office buildings. Why were we in a medical practice? And they said, oh, this place has a wonderful pharmacy. Well, what is the pharmacy going to do for us? Well, the pharmacy caters to the doctors. The pharmacy has a doctor's lounge in back of it, and the personnel of the pharmacy will order lunches for the doctors. They have magazines there for them. They try and make them comfortable, and they're coddling the docs in the building, because they figure the docs will use them for prescribing purposes, and they'll get business from the docs. And it wouldn't hurt you to go and hang out with the docs at lunchtime. If you bring a bag lunch, whatever you do, go eat it with the doctors, because they'll get to know you, and maybe they'll give you referrals too. Well, I never got a damn referral from one of them. And in the few years I tried to be there periodically. And the truth is, it felt very tedious being there. They were not very interesting people. They wanted to talk about what was happening at the country club. They wanted to talk about their investment portfolios. And they wanted to talk about whether they should invest some more money in real estate. And they were rising on the socioeconomic ladder. That's all that seemed to matter to them. And they had no interest in anything cultural, intellectual whatsoever. So I was very disappointed in the general preoccupations of the physicians in the building. So I think a reason to hire somebody to come be a staff member with us was because she had a husband who was an internist. That didn't mean much. She seemed like a worthwhile, attractive, and intelligent woman. That pleased me, and I was happy to hire her. We soon found out we had a lot in common. She had 2 children too. She also had an infant, just like I did. Mine was already moving towards toddlerhood. She still had a fairly small infant, and she had 2 girls. She had another girl who was about the age of my son. And we took to hanging out with each other. Sometimes her nanny would not be available, and she would have to cut her day short and go home and take the kids somewhere, and I would often go to, I had some flexibility. I would go pick up my kids from home, and we would spend time with the 4 children and the 2 of us. And we began to talk to each other. And I soon ascertained that she was restless and unhappy in her marriage too, just like I was. And one thing led to another, and I started to have an affair with her. And I enjoyed her a great deal. In some ways, I think she was more aloof. I never felt as bonded with her as I had with the woman I had lost, but I certainly enjoyed the time we spent together. And I enjoyed her kindness. I enjoyed her wit. I enjoyed her intelligence. She was a good young psychologist, and a pleasure to be with. The affair ended abruptly and horribly, however. One day, when she got the office, she said she was going to have some free time in the afternoon. Her children, the nanny was taking them to somebody's birthday party, so they weren't going to be home. And her husband had a conference that he had to attend in the afternoon, and her home would be empty for us to go visit. She had always wanted me to see her house. I was curious, but something didn't feel right. I said, it feels dangerous to go to your house. Why do we have to go to your house? She said, well, you wanted to see it, and I'd love to show off. I have a really special house, and I'd like you to see it. So against my better instincts, I went, and we took my car from work. We were going to go for a while, and then I was going to drive her back to work again. And she knew the nanny would get home at a certain time. So I parked my car in their driveway. I went in, I looked at the house, I looked at the bedrooms, and one thing led to another, and we wound up in bed with each other. And I said, "This is dangerous." She said, "No, there won't be a problem. I know when the nanny's coming, and my husband is tied up in a conference." So there I was, naked in bed with her, talking, lying naked and talking, and I heard a car in the driveway. It was her husband. He was coming home. And he pulled up in the driveway behind my car. I don't know whose car he thought it was or what he was thinking, but that car was blocked. I had no way to take the car and get out of there. And I heard the front door open and he called out, "Dear, I'm home." And I was butt naked. I went and I grabbed all my clothes. I ran out the sliding door into their backyard, grabbing my clothes and trying to put my clothes on while I was out there. I tried to figure out where I could go, where I could hide, where I could get out of there. There was the fence separating this property from the next one was fairly low. I figured if I took a running start, I could probably jump over, not jump over it literally, but grab it and throw myself over it. So I did. I grabbed the fence. I had my clothes on, tucked under one arm. I grabbed with a hand and I hurled myself over the fence and landed naked in the mud on the other side of the fence. And the Japanese guard was there looking at me. Who was this apparition that's plopped into the backyard? We're about 3/4 of a mile from the main boulevard that goes up and down the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. And I figured there must be a car rental place somewhere along the boulevard. So I went down to the boulevard. I stopped into a coffee shop. I asked where the nearest car rental place was. They told me. I asked them if they could borrow a phone. We didn't have cell phones then. They were kind. They lent me a phone. I called to reserve a car, and I walked the rest of the way to the car rental place, and I drove back to the office, terrified. What the hell is she going to tell him? I hope she was creative and inventive and could tell him that she had had a migraine headache and had come home for a nap, and that's why she was in bed. And her car had a problem, it wouldn't start. And I had graciously lent her her car, and she needed to return the car to the office later in the day. I hope she would tell him that. No, she didn't. She told him that she had been having a love affair with me. She told him the truth. And when I got home that night, she never came back to the office. When I got home that night, my former wife was screaming at me because he demanded to know the home phone number of my own. And he had called my former wife to tell her that I had been unfaithful to her with his wife that afternoon in his home. And my wife was throwing things at me, cursing at me, spitting at me, and like a raging character out of a bad movie. And I said I was leaving. I took the rental car and I went to a hotel for the night. And I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe I'm getting a divorce now. And in the morning, I went back to take a shower and get some clothes. And she had calmed down. And she said, "You're never allowed to do that to me again." And I said, "I'm never going to do that to you again." And she went about her business then as if nothing had happened. And I knew I had not been liberated. She was going to give me a second chance, and I was going to stay at home in my terrible marriage. And I'll leave it there because the third person who showed up in my life was my present wife. And that's a much longer story. And I don't want to spend all my time on my strange struggle to find some comfort in my life. Let me go on to the next thing. I always want to keep a parallel track running on how I was developing as a therapist. So I had listened to the first case I had read to you. Didn't sound bad to listen to. It sounded reasonably interesting. So I have a second case that illustrates what my work was like, what my limitations were, and what I was trying to do to overcome them during that first decade of being out in practice. So here is the case I shall read. It's called, "I'm Still Ashamed of My Ineptitude." Before I tell the story, I want to apologize for my own conduct in the tale you're about to read. I'm going to reveal my very clumsy and stupid attempts to be of help to a couple I'll describe. I was so terribly limited when I met them. I'd been out of graduate school only for about 4 years at that time. My education and training had ill prepared me for receiving them with any skill to speak of. My own life experiences were so limited, and I too was beginning to feel trapped in a marriage that was an agony to endure. I was helpless in it, and for the longest time, I was helpless with my new clients. I certainly cared a great deal about wanting to respond to the pair in healing ways, but I was rendered inadequate for the challenge, not only by my professional and personal limitations, but as importantly, by the limitations of what was then the state of the art in my calling. In the intervening decades since I struggled with this pair, it comforts me somehow to note that there has been an explosion in our knowledge of the causes and consequences of relationship distress, and an equal expansion of our knowledge and understanding of what those of us who are sought for some kind of aid can do to go about making lives better in so many ways. I cringe when I revisit what I write below, and I am full of what I would do if I were to meet the two today. Yet, here goes. It was in the early 1960s when I first met Bob and Betty. I had been in practice for less than a decade, as I had noted. Bob was to all intents, quote, dragged in, close quotes, to see me by his termagant wife. Betty had been the one to make the initial telephone contact with me, complaining bitterly when I returned her call that her husband was a cold and unemotional person, that he was withdrawn and unavailable to her, and that she was considering leaving him if he did not get help for himself. She wanted me to see him so that, as was implied, I could make him, quote, better, unquote. I remind myself that I always dread seeing a new client for whom some third party attempts to set up an initial appointment, a client who will then probably be coming in with the veiled purpose of placating the appointment maker, and not necessarily out of any sense of internal, personally embraced desire. While engaging a new client under such circumstances is not impossible, it certainly is easier and more pleasant if the client yearns to see me. My first reaction to my contact with the soon-to-be revealed lives of Bob and Betty was not an exception to this expectation of mine. What I was hearing sounded rather odious to me. Since my instincts were warning me about how this new adventure was starting, I did not rush to accept Betty's assignment that she serve as a go-between for us two men, and that I give her some possible times I might be available to meet with Bob. Besides, by late in the first decade of being in practice, I was already starting to move well beyond what had been a rather traditional psychoanalytic training in my graduate education, a training that emphasized intense individual psychotherapy sessions as the preferred mechanism for healing. I therefore made a quick decision instead to experiment with the then, quote, new, unquote, field of couples therapy. And I suggested to Betty that in view of the fact that she herself clearly sounded quite unhappy, I would prefer to meet both of them for at least the initial visit, and then make some decision about how to proceed after that. Betty reluctantly agreed to the plan. It did not take many minutes of my first consultation with the couple for me to begin to appreciate how absolutely stuck the lives of Betty and Bob had become. Their discourse, or better yet, Betty's stridently repeated litany of complaints about Bob, went on and on and cycled back around to the beginning in a fashion that was both unceasing and unchanging. It was maddening, and to observe his grunts of assent or dissent, his limited range of communications with us about his plight. I quickly decided that it would be better if it would be their coupledom that would be my client rather than either of them separately. And as the initial visit was drawing to a close, I told them I believed there. To begin individual work with Bob, I had thought to myself. I was sure he would sit with me mainly in silence, waiting for me to tell him what to do, and then forcing me in the end to play dentist with him, attempting to get him to open wide so that I could try to examine the psychological teeth of his consciousness. He I was afraid keep his jaws quite clenched. Betty was uncertain about why. As I began to hold regular sessions with the two, I became as oppressed and bogged down in their unceasing ritual of stuckness as were Bob and Betty. On some occasion, when I should have been listening, I simply sat and daydreamed. Or would listening have made any difference anyhow? It was a pain to try to listen. I remember that sometimes I would imagine that I should spare the three of us our collective miseries. I felt if I simply would bring a recorder and capture the proceedings of any particular session, I could then just play those transactions over and over again on each subsequent occasion when Bob and Betty appeared in my office. Every session was like all the others anyhow, totally unvarying. Oh, but if we could ever have contented ourselves instead to have the recording to play, then the three of us might have simply rested in silence and perhaps more productively have forgotten each other and instead allowed ourselves to withdraw into some sweet daydreaming about different matters altogether. I, I groan with dismay as I sit here at my keyboard and reconstruct the story I heard from the two. No, not from the two, from Betty. As I'd anticipated, Bob hardly ever spoke a word. Betty was the virago, spewing out her complaining attacks. Bob would abandon her to that role, a role he would encounter by absorbing her tongue lashings and weary, unspeaking resignation, his body language in its soundless eloquence bearing mute testimony to his noble martyrdom. Sometimes he would sigh, sometimes a futile, "Oh, Betty," a weary phrase of ineffective protest would escape Bob's lips. So, what were Betty's complaints? I learned that Bob was away from home too much, leaving Betty to be the sole manager of the household and the prime parent for their 16-year-old daughter. She informed me that Bob was the managing supervisor for the world's largest grapefruit cooperative, the one located in California's Coachella Valley. He had enormous responsibilities, overseeing the maintenance of hundreds of square miles of orchards, arranging the watering and fertilizing of the trees, fighting periodic infestations of various winged and microscopic predators, using the latest tactics to mitigate the effect of freezes in the winters, recruiting and supervising migrant workers at harvest season, and directing the employees in the cooperative's plants in which the best picked fruits were packed for shipments to the nation's produce markets and the lesser ones were converted to juice or to concentrate. Bob left home every day early in the morning around dawn to drive the 2 hours to his work site. He did not return until 8 p.m. each evening, sweaty and exhausted. Betty would reheat dinner for him. Bob would watch television for a little, but he would typically fall asleep on the couch, wake with a start an hour or so later, and then drag himself off to bed so he could ready himself to repeat the pattern the next day. Weekends, when Bob did not have to make an emergency visit to the orchards or to the plant to resolve one or another crisis, he devoted himself to the chores and errands that Betty had assigned him to do on a list she had created during the week. In our sessions, Betty would whine that they had no life. She would berate Bob for his apathy and for his fatigue. She would tell him she deserved to have someone who would make conversation with her, who would take her out to an occasional dinner, who would be interested in her problems and be supportive, and who would have lust for her. Bob would just listen, occasionally rolling his eyes skyward as if he were asking God to bear witness to his capacity to endure. A succession of weekly visits with these two went by without any real change in their interactions. As I noted, I am saddened that I did not then have available to me what would have been the extremely useful visions and perspectives generated since by my colleagues who have conducted seminal studies of couples and the family systems theorists who over the past decades have arrived at wonderful insights about the causes and resolutions of distressed states in families and couples. So I tried to be of some help to these two unfortunates within the serious limits of my then current wisdom and as well as I could at the time. It was not good enough. I attempted to no avail to provide both some practical and some psychological aid for them. My most immediate and obvious observation, of course, was that Bob's work life was certainly a difficult one at best, but that his fatigue and his unavailability were greatly enhanced by his having to drive 4 hours on the highway every day. I asked them if they had considered moving the family home to the Coachella Valley so Bob could be around at more reasonable hours and free himself of a large part of his tiredness. What a stupid, obvious, clumsy, and useful attempt on my part to be helpful. Surprise, surprise. My innocent suggestion provoked another diatribe from Betty, this time directed at me. They had lived in the Coachella Valley some years ago, she informed me acidly. It was no place for anyone other than Bob. Only wetbacks lived there. There was no cultural stimulation. The schools were inadequate. It was not a fit environment for raising children. There were no friends for Betty. Now I was forced to listen to how Betty had nagged and nagged and nagged until she had at last persuaded Bob to make the move into our urban area where they were currently living and to embrace the necessity for Bob's having to make the long daily commute to work. At times when I could no longer endure Betty's complaints, I would ask her to reflect about the behavior of snails. Pounding on their shells, I reminded her, was not a good tactic for encouraging them to emerge. At other times, I used a different metaphor, likening Bob to a man who, in the face of her attacks, had constructed a medieval fortress for himself, one complete with moat, portcullises, drawbridges, turrets, and ports. The walls of the fortress were thick, and Bob peered balefully out through its ports, searching for the enemy. If Betty wanted his companionship, sounding the blare of trumpets and unleashing cannonades against his fortified position were not going to achieve a damn thing. I told her that I could not promise her anything would work, but she might improve her chances of securing more of what she claimed to desire by accepting the fact that Bob was fearful and wounded, throwing down her weapons, trying to invite him instead to renewed trust and to forays outside of his fort, had to learn how to play the flute, play in the meadow in front of the castle, sounding sweetly on a flute, calling out in kindness and understanding, juggling balls, being seductive and delightful, and offering Bob the opportunity to give in to a joyous abandon instead of being demanded to interact with her because he was being punished into performing some duty he owed her. Betty steadfastly resisted my importuning. She told me she resented my suggestion. She made it clear to me over and over again that, as she said, she had too much bitterness ever to forgive him, and it was his responsibility to be more forthcoming and to put forward the effort that might make her care again. I would sigh and tell her that it sounded to me that she wanted more of all to punish Bob and wanted me to appreciate how loathsome he was, even more than she wanted her life to improve. I also tried to tell her that it did not matter whose, quote, responsibility, close quotes, it was to do what. I have found that life is best if the one who had a felt longing, and in this case it appeared to be her, accepted the assignment of searching for a way that longing could be fulfilled. I also remembered an old Hungarian proverb. Its translation goes, if the heart is bitter, not even sugar tastes sweet. But I kept that one to myself. I had no better luck attempting to have Bob make some healing movements from his side. For example, as the three of us sat together in my consulting room and Betty would unleash her weekly outbursts of discontent, I would sometimes turn to Bob and say, Bob, how do you feel when you listen to what Betty is saying? Bob would typically reply, I don't know. If I pressed him further, he would fall back on, I've heard it all before. And me, I know she feels that way. I would groan in even greater dismay and attempt to have him see that it was not his view of Betty's feelings about which I was inquiring. I wanted to know about the stream of his experiencing. He would then look at me blankly, and his body language would speak to me of the painful truth that his emotional life had died. I felt so frustrated. On other occasions, I would say to Bob that he appeared to receive no respect, kindness, or love from Betty. Why did he stay? In a wooden fashion, Bob would say simply, she's my wife, that's my home, and I love my daughter. I wanted these two to interact in any way. If only Bob would come alive with anything, yell, shut your goddamn mouth, or I want to kill you, or get the hell off my back, or I'm just putting up with you because I stopped loving you years ago, or I'm only waiting for our daughter to grow up so I can leave you. Then my work would have been possible. The opposite of love is not dissension and hatred, it is silent indifference. If these two had contended mutually with each other about anything and in any way, I could have had something with which to work. Bob never helped me. We went on and on in this useless fashion for weeks. In the end, after a seemingly interminable period, the impasse of Bob's and Betty's marriage became unbearable to me. Not knowing what else to do, I suggested that they come and join a couples therapy group that I was in the process of forming with four other couples. I was hoping in vain that the addition of other people and the impact of different kinds of conversations might alter the flow between the three of us. And besides, I wanted other conversations with other persons for myself so that I could escape being trapped in the poisonous futility, the course between Bob and Betty, and not have to spend every minute alone with them, bogged down in my feelings of futility. Putting them in group, uh, Putting them in group turned out, however, not to have been such a wonderful idea after all. If anything, having them in such a forum appeared to be significantly more frustrating. Before now, Betty now had an even larger audience to which she could play, and she tended to monopolize our evenings by relating in endless, boring detail the ways that Bob had been unavailable, insensitive, and a disappointment to her the preceding week. The other couples were restrained in their modes of expression. And besides, I think it was a secret comfort for them to be able to hide their own comments in silent complicity, avoiding any work of their own. They limited their own participation to that of being the audience for Betty's longing to be on center stage. So the other couples mainly indulged her and let her go on complaining about Bob group session after group session. I cringe as I read what I have written. I suffer anew for the awful pain of Bob and Betty. Clueless for so long about how to address. In my reflections, as I now remember the pair, I find myself creating daydreams about meeting them again for the first time today and about how I proceed to engage with the work I now know would be possible. Doing it this time with all the wisdom and knowledge both I and my discipline have secured over the past half century. My regret is not endless, nor do I have to go on heaping regret and contempt on myself about this botched work, though. During the interval, the couple came to visit my consulting room. Without knowing what I was doing or even meaning to do so, In the end, I did find a way to touch their troubled lives in a more helpful fashion. One evening in a group session, I simply reached what I experienced as a final internal limit to my capacity to tolerate my frustration with Betty and Bob. I hit my personal wall. Besides, I also had been growing alarmed about the survival of my group, sensing that a continuation of the miserable fashion in which we were all spending our time together would soon lead to a rapid demoralization of the other group members. I wouldn't have been surprised if the group disintegrated, other couples deciding not to return. None of the other couples had had the courage to shatter the rules of ordinary polite discourse, to speak of their discomfort, or to try to put any limits on the behavior of the toxic pair. So if anything different were to be made to happen, it would have to fall to me to do something about them. And if I failed to do so, I would be responsible for failure not only with Bob and Betty, but with the four other couples as well. Ouch. I became desperate, not wanting to embrace a debacle. On the evening I remember, Betty had started out in the expected fashion. This time, however, I felt my gorge rising, and before she could drone on for too many minutes, I impulsively yelled at her, "Would you shut your goddamn mouth?" I went on, "I'm not going to let you continue doing this anymore. It's not getting you anywhere. We're all sick of it. You portray Bob as the evil genius of your life. You keep carping at him. You persist in telling us what a miserable wretch he is and how you suffer at his hands, playing to us for sympathy and comfort. But nor have you listened to anything I've said to you for many, many weeks now about how you could take some responsibility for improving your relationship with Bob. Well, I'm not going to listen to your complaints anymore. We're not here to comfort you or to be persuaded that Bob is a horrible person. So you be quiet, and I'll tell you when you might have my permission once more to say anything in here again. That is, if I ever get ready to let you talk." I was far from done, though. I turned to Bob and said, "I hate you for letting me do this. Damn you, you make me do your work for you. What the hell is the matter with you? Is there anyone home there? You put up with her behavior over and over again. I can't believe what she does to you feels good, yet you don't do anything to protest or to stop her. I hate all this. You leave me in the position of caring more about what's happening to you in your life than you do, for God's sake." Bob spoke. He replied wearily, "She's been like that ever since our son died." I gasped. Bob's words were riveting. It was as if a lightning bolt had suddenly illuminated the features of a dark landscape. I had known these people for almost a year and had never until the present moment heard from them that there had been a second child in this family, one who had died. Now Betty began sobbing in anguish. "It's his fault. He killed my Danny." My God, I felt frightened. Was Silent Bob truly a killer? He'd always appeared so inoffensive to me. Bob then told the rest of the family story in a flat, weary tone of voice. He had never before spoken at such length and so articulately. Their son Danny, so Bob reported, had been uncertain about what to do with his life when he was moving towards graduation from high school 3 years earlier. He was bright and had accelerated in school, so he was still only 17 at the time of his commencement. At the end of the son's high school career, as the end of the son's high school career had approached, and after some thinking, the young man had decided he would like to enlist in the Air Force, give himself time to mature, learn a trade in the Air Force, and accumulate some GI Bill benefits. Then he would go to college. His mother had objected. Betty was an old-time left-wing liberal and opposed military service for anyone, let alone her own son. Since Danny was underage, though, he was not free to go ahead unaided and implement his own plan in spite of his mother's objections. He needed help. At least one of his parents had to sign his enlistment papers. Bob and Betty had had a set of serious arguments about Danny's plans. Over Betty's strenuous protests, dire warnings, and poisonous insults, Bob had at last agreed to honor Danny's wishes and to impose those of his wife. Bob signed the papers and Danny entered service. Danny adjusted quickly to military life. After basic training in Texas, he advanced rapidly a grade and soon became a supply sergeant assigned to a cargo ferrying unit based in Merced, California. To to participate in a monthly weekend training mission going aloft in a cargo aircraft. The extra money would help, for he met was spending time with a local girl who lived in Merced. The two were thinking about living together. Once again, Betty was alarmed. Once again, she begged Bob to talk Danny out of his desire. Once again, Bob told her that she should not attempt to curb their son. He accused her of being driven by an over anxious and overprotective attitude about life. He told her to be quiet and he gave Danny their best wishes. 3 months later, the third training flight that Danny had taken, the airplane carrying him that day plunged into the side of a Sierra peak, killing all around with a fiery wreck that started a forest fire. After Bob told us the story of his son's death, told it in his muted voice devoid of feeling, Betty began mourning in our presence with a scalding intensity. Her heartbreak was pitiable to witness. Between choking sobs, she began again to reproach Bob. If only you hadn't let him enlist. If only you hadn't let him fly. If only you'd listened to me, he'd be alive. I could still be holding my baby. You killed him, you son of a bitch. There are transcendent moments in life. The revelations of Danny's demise permitted me to understand so many moments I had experienced with the two in a different way. Over the next several months and with the limits of my capabilities, I tried to achieve some liberating good for the couple by using my new appreciation of their suffering and their predicament to shape our conversations. It was abundantly clear to me that Betty had refused to accept her son's death. Yes, I understood how absolutely devastating a death of a child could be for a parent, at least from the protective perspective of one who has not had to endure the experience directly, but only has been an all too frequent observer of the event. Even though more than 2 years had passed, permit herself the fullness of the complex feeling states that always surround sudden loss of her son. Nor could she allow herself to acknowledge how random and capricious was fate. There had to be an answer. There had to be someone or something that could be held responsible. So she blamed Bob. Within minutes of having felt her future smashed in the imagined wreckage of that downed aircraft, Betty began what proved to be a continuing diatribe against her husband, transforming her anguished passions away from mourning and instead into lashing out at him for his recklessness, for his insensitivity, and for his lack of love for her and for Danny. And at those moments when the violent amputation of her son's life became totally unbearable and she could no longer bear the intensity of her pain, she would end by yelling at Bob that Bob had killed Danny. For his part, Bob could neither block nor contain Betty's tirades. I felt compassion for him. I came to understand that his frozen forbearance had been created because a large part of him believed Betty's screaming assessment was horribly accurate. As with any parent in his position, my client was consumed in the face of Danny's death with his own sense of guilt and with his grief. Betty's words fell on fertile soil. The devil seeds of her hatred and recriminations germinated on the loam of Bob's deeply felt remorse and conviction about his personal culpability in the tragedy. He tried to argue with her that parents could not buffer their children from every risk. He reminded her correctly that there is danger in all our lives and parents must set their children free to manage the danger as best as they can, with the parents containing their own anxiety and not buffeting the children with it. But Betty's unremitting attacks and Bob's own growing sense that the attacks were deserved carried the day in the end, and Bob was soon reduced to putting up with his wife's strident outbursts of contempt as if they were his due in life. In this fashion, he attempted to expiate his sin and at the same time lovingly tried to provide Betty with the distraction from her sense of loss that she seemed to require from him. In the weeks after the revelation, I tried to facilitate Betty's return to her unfinished mourning. Over her strong initial protest, I sent her to make weekly Sunday visits to Danny's grave, assigning Bob the responsibility for accompanying her and for holding her if she would let him. Gradually, Betty was able to grieve and to begin to move towards accepting the finality of her loss. I reminded her frequently during the period of her grief work, that hating and blaming Bob would not bring Danny back, that the loss had crucified Bob as much as it had her, and that all I hoped for was that the two of them might begin to be of some comfort to each other, rather than having to go on, each of them, treating the other as the enemy. Slowly, Betty's imagery came to be focused on her sadness and emptiness, on her hatred and bitterness, and the emotional life of the couple gentled down out of the prior turbulence, moving now to a more meandering stillness. Within 6 months of Bob's confession in group about his dead son, the couple departed my life more at peace with each other, and I assumed I would never see them again. I was wrong. 2 years later, I received a call from Bob. He said that he wanted to come in with Betty again because there was a matter he needed to work out with her, and he thought it would be helpful to do so with me being available to support them in the effort. I readily assented and scheduled the visit. After some idle moments spent in gossiping about what had transpired in their lives since last we spoke, Bob settled into the matter that he wanted to address. In contrast to my previous experience with this couple, it was apparent to me that Bob had now rejoined the living and that he was wanting to take care of his life and to interact with Betty from a posture of shared power and energy. He no longer wanted to be just deferent with her and to abdicate any effort to make his life happen. He exuded energy, apprehension, steadfastness, and an emotional accessibility with his every word. While I could sense that a profound shift in the power relationship negotiated by and between the couple had taken place, I was once again taken totally off balance by what Bob had come in to discuss. Quote, Betty, I've been talking to the Israeli consulate the past few months. They reached out to me. Our daughter's going off to college in the fall. The house is paid for. You know, we stopped fighting with each other so much the past couple of years, but there really isn't a great deal between us anymore. And they want me in Israel. They want to put me in charge of the whole future development of their grapefruit industry. I decided this week that I'm going to go in December and decided that I'm going to go by myself. I think I'll be better off alone, and I'm not asking you to come with me. You have your life here, your sisters, our daughter, and your friends. You can have the house. The Israelis are going to put me up and pay me wonderfully. I'll make out, and I'll even be able to go on supporting you. I want you to have a good life. If you decide to divorce me, I will understand. But it won't be a life with me any longer. Betty went into shock. She had no preparation for Bob's announcement. I asked Bob if he was sure about his decision, and he answered in a steadfast fashion that quickly persuaded me that he had proceeded beyond his personal point of no return. Psychologically, he was already in Israel. All that remained was the tying up of loose ends and extricating himself from the few commitments that still needed to be carried to closure. He had brought Betty to me so that I might comfort her as he got ready to leave. It fell to me to keep Betty comfort for about a year longer. helping her to get herself ready for the shock of separation from Bob that was about to fall on her, living through the final acts the two shared, sending Mimi off to college, then Betty taking Bob to the airport and to his El Al flight, and finally counseling and guiding her as she reestablished herself as a single woman. When she left me, she seemed to have become so wistful, so bittersweet, so quiet. All the raging intensity and pain thrashing about that had characterized her earlier conduct some years before had disappeared. As my remembrance of my time with Bob and Betty runs its course, I reflect about it must have felt like to have been Bob. The more than 40 years of personal experience I've accumulated since I know these two lead me to appreciation of how much better I am now, able to feel my way into Bob's plight, to experience his anguish and his stuckness that I could at the time I was working with a couple. What a life Bob had had. He had labored over the decades in his silent, unexpressive fashion to meet his obligations, serving his employers, attending to what he believed his wife needed from him, and attempting to oversee the development of the children within the limits of his capacities for empathy and tenderness. For years, Bob had paid little or no heed to the yearnings of his self. Indeed, he felt an insufficient entitlement to be a self. Thoreau's comment about most men living lives of quiet desperation rises to tug at my awareness. Yes, as does any beast of burden, Bob had simply led himself forth each day to embrace his rounds of commitment, staggering forward under the loads he embraced. And he went to his rest each night, wrung out of any vitality, only to have to arise to repeat the experience the next day. Bob was awarded little comfort, companionship, or appreciation for his efforts, nor did he ask for any from anyone. How well the textures of his life approximated what he had been taught to believe that men were. How well his devotion to his self-assigned responsibilities accorded with the age-old prescription for the destinies of males. Somehow, however, he had become unstuck as he entered the later stage of his middle years. Looking backward over the intervening years, I believe that he had imploded from the combined and powerful effect of three forces impinging on his stuckness: the death of his son, the forthcoming emancipation of his daughter, and the foreshadowing of his own approaching death. The first two of these experiences represented a lifting of demands for his devotion, his subordination. The last dragged him unwillingly and unwittingly into asking anew what this unseen and unapprehended purposes of his life might be in some altered existence, or perhaps for vitality he had never known before. The possibility for investing himself into something fresh, something that might prove to be a far larger immortality project than the simple raising of his daughter could be, or the pleasing of his employer at the grapefruit ranch might be. The offer also provided a vehicle for letting go of his last remaining commitment, that to Betty. Besides, as he put it, Betty was going to be cared for by Bob, even in his absence. His prudence through the years had generated ample funds for her use over the remainder of her life, and she had available the emotional sustenance of others, so that he would no longer have to be concerned with her fate. The doors of Bob's prison had at last creaked open. Bob had raced to embrace a new identity with a steadfastness, resolve, and a hot quickening of blood flowing through the chambers of his heart. I salute him for having chosen life over zombiehood. After dealing with some more mourning, now for her husband and not for her son, Betty steadied herself. She discovered she had a long withheld desire, now possible to fulfill. And when Mimi enrolled in community college, so did Betty. She focused on a curriculum that provided her some employment skills along with her AA degree. And when she had completed the transit through the program, successfully entered the workforce for the first time since she had been a teenager. Upon securing her job, she went back to thank one of her profs that she had enjoyed the most. At the end of their conversation, he asked her for a date. I said goodbye to her soon after her first date in the singles world. There may be three morals in this story. My profession continues to evolve in its capabilities to be helpful. And we individuals who pursue it also become more effective with increasing knowledge and increasing experience. The price we pay for being members of a culture always seem to bring about unquestioning allegiance, the playing out aside role prescriptions, even if these kill our experiences. My two clients set themselves free from cultural expectations and found paths forward in the later years of their lives, paths that nourished their souls much better than they were able to experience as long as they were carrying out their earlier empty rituals. All right, it looks like that's where I'm gonna end. When we take up next time, I have to tell you about other things that were evolving in my profession. And I will start with a time I spent as a stint on the board of directors of the California Psychological Association. But seeing that our time's up, I will turn this over to my constituents here.
Arthur, I have a question for you about your couple and the experience you had in terms of doing couples therapy. If your relationship was your own personal relationship was very turbulent, how did that affect your ability, capacity, and desire to do couples therapy? And what parallels also did you experience in the process of doing the couples therapy?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question.
You stole my question, Scott.
Now you're going to have to think of another question. I made a comment to another colleague in the months after I finally had found the courage to pull myself out of my just terribly destructive marriage, destructive for everybody who was trapped in that family. The comment I made was during all the years before that I had been in practice, with one exception, and it's the couple I told you about, nobody separated or got a divorce among the people who either came in for counseling, couples counseling, or came in individually. But one of the biggest complaints was that their marriage was very, very painful. And as soon after I left, a large number of my clients started separating from the people they had been attached to. In the transference, I must have been giving off signals that no matter how much bad the pain was or how miserable life was, one should bear in and don't give up the search for something better. Don't stop trying. Keep it going at all costs and wait until the children grow up, just as I was planning to do before you made any rash moves or broke up the parenting. Hold it together for the sake of the children. I was surprised, as a matter of fact, that the couple I read about had come apart. I didn't think that they were going to do that. They had only 2 years to go until their daughter would be starting college. She went to community college, so it might have been 4 years before she went away and actually left the house. I thought they could easily tolerate it because the real terrible parts of it had been muted by the therapy. So they would put up with it for the rest of the years ahead, and they surprised me. After a while, I purposely changed my mind about the use of my transference and countertransference. Because we suffer not only from the countertransference, our reaction to the pulls that our clients are putting on us, we misinterpret their behavior. We make transferential mistakes in thinking we understand what they're talking about or who they are, because we have our own blind spots, just like our clients have their blind spots and project onto us certain attributes that are not ours at all. And we have to work with our own transference and our own countertransference. There came a time later on, not about divorcing because I had mastered one, but about risk-taking of various kinds. And what I started to do was, if a client came in who was struggling with some kind of risk that I knew I was very averse to getting into myself, I would push at them and encourage them to attack that and try and figure out how to get through it on their own. Because by listening to them and working with them, I would be learning things, and I would get more reassurance that one could safely do that. It would give me courage to take better care of my own life. And I will confess this right now.
That's very brave of you to encourage everybody to go over the top, blow the whistle.
That's right.
Yeah, I oftentimes ask myself if I'm asking my clients to be more brave than I am.
Yes, that's right. Well, I was purposely asking my clients to be more brave than I am. And watching what they were able to do gave me more courage that I could grow more bravery.
Yeah.
Do you have a substitute question?
Yeah, I've come up with one. So in your third affair, did you remember to keep the track shoes on and maybe not park your car in the driveway?
In my third affair, I never went to my affair partner's house to couple up with her. It was always on neutral territory.
Very
Yes,
good. See,
we do learn some ridiculous things from our experiences.
True. All right, that's all I have. I don't. Scott really nailed right what I was going to go for.
Thank you, Scott. That was really a wonderful question. I appreciate it a lot.
Do you feel also, Arthur, that a particular loss affected your own personal relationship in the beginning, that affected either the unraveling or the discontentment of that relationship?
Oh, you're anticipating material I'm going to get into subsequently when I talk about my third affair to my affair partner, who is now my wife of 49 years. One of the things that absolutely set me free was a week before I met her, my mother died. And my mother had been terribly distressed for a few years because my middle sister had gotten a divorce. She was the first person in the family to get a divorce. My mother was very appalled by that. Not only did she get a divorce, but she was shockingly irresponsible for my mother's position, because she moved out into the arms of her lover, and she left her daughter behind full time with my mother's granddaughter's father. She left both of them. She bailed on her child as well as on her husband. And my mother frequently would shake her finger at me, and she would say, "I know you have trouble in your marriage, but don't do to me what your sister did to me. I couldn't stand a second one doing that to me." She died. I knew the options were open to me again. So that was a strange gift I got out of my mother's death. I didn't have to listen to her distress, what I continued to think about doing. I was fighting that temptation. I was still hewing to the plan of I will leave finally when the last child turns 18. All right. Anything else before I say goodbye?
No.
Okay.
All
Thank
right.
you.
We'll see you next time.
All right.
See you next Friday.
time. Okay. Be well.
Bye.
Bye, guys.